My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's a blessing to have all of you here today. Every year, the Cathedral chooses a theme, and our theme this year is bridges. And we've been talking about how to build bridges between different communities, between people on the right and people on the left, even in our own personal lives. It's like a year of reconciliation. So we've really challenged people to go and reach out to people who they need to be reconciled with. But today we're talking about building bridges between the generations. Today's teenagers, the turbulent bridge between children and adults, seem to be struggling to make these connections, and they're suffering from an epidemic of anguish that we simply cannot ignore. Last year, nearly 1/5 seriously considered suicide. How can teenagers and preteens cope with growing up in an entirely new world? And how do we, ostensibly the adults in the room, escape being paralyzed by problems that didn't exist less than a decade ago? Our guest today is a person who I've had a similar interaction with about 10 years ago, Christine Carter. I'm so glad to see her. She is at the UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. She's the author of Raising Happiness, The Sweet Spot, How to Accomplish More by Doing Less, and her new book, The New Adolescence, Raising Happy and Successful Teens in an Age of Anxiety and Distraction. So please join me in welcoming Christine Carter.
Thank you. It's so fun to be here.
I was telling Christine that she came down to the church in Los Altos. We had 300 people in the room, and it was like everybody was hanging on your every word. And I said for the next 4 months, I'd use different things I learned in the talk. I took all these notes, and it was really helpful for my sermons.
So great. I'm glad to hear I wasn't spitting in the wind.
No, definitely. It was like throwing the rock in the pond and all the ripples going onto the other edges. But one of the things that I've seen too in the popular press is just how much young people are suffering and how much things have changed just from 2012. So in the course of 8 years, the statistics about depression, anxiety, suicide, they've just it's been a terrible time for young people.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where the statistics come from and just what are some of the causes for that decline in mental health?
Yeah. Well, so we know that that of course all the new technologies have really changed everything for all of us, but definitely for the development of our kids. So smartphones and social media and iPads, this generation of teenagers is the first, of course, to be raised on it. They have no memory of no internet or any sort of analog life. And it's really changed the way that they interact with each other and their social development. So of course, social skills are impacted when you're doing most of your interaction over text.
Right.
And but everything has kind of changed, right? So they don't go to the mall anymore, like teenagers in previous generations, which we might think is not such a big deal, but it means that they're spending a lot more time alone. So they still shop. They shop actually more. They're super consumers, but they're just shopping alone online. And so this generation is much more likely to, they spend about an hour less hanging out with their friends per day and than previous generations. And that loneliness or that time spent alone makes them really lonely. And then loneliness, of course, leads to depression and anxiety. So there's a lot happening.
There is. In the book, you talk about it being the loneliest generation of all time.
There's an irony to that, too, right?
Exactly.
Like we think of them as the most connected generation we've ever seen. But in fact, they're only connected online. They're not only connected online, but the connection we see is their online connectedness, which doesn't really count for the human nervous system, right? The human nervous system does not like to be alone. It likes eye contact. It needs touch to be soothed, and it's not getting that from social media.
No, exactly. And it's astonishing, too, just how much time they're spending using the social media. I wonder if over this time you've noticed a corresponding decline in well-being for adults, and just how is that different than what children are facing today?
Yeah, we're actually seeing declines in well-being across the board, but we're seeing. So how is it different? I think it's really different because this is the development of our children, right? So as adults, we definitely are suffering from some of the same things things that kids are. And it's not that the technology is bad or that social media is 100% bad. There's really a dosage effect. It's sort of overuse leads to things like exhaustion and a decrease in sleep. And that affects adults as well as kids, but it's affecting the kids' development in a much more profound way, right? When they stop sleeping enough, they stop learning the way that they should in school, they become more and more disconnected. It's a bigger downward spiral.
Yeah. Jim Steyer from the Common Sense Media talks about almost this generation, almost like they're guinea pigs. Like we've never done, it's like we're experimenting on our technology on them. And that was, he was sitting in that chair and he said that, and just a light bulb went over my head. And I wonder, what are we learning in terms of just like what are like some of the best practices for how we do use these technologies? Because you said it's almost like a dosage effect. Well, is there a way for us to decline our dosage so that we get everything in the right?
Yeah. I think it's really important for us to remember that we are trying to parent these kids through one of the greatest social transformations in human history, if not the greatest social transformation in human history. Everything has changed. And certainly people parented through, the invention of the printing press and other big social transformations. And I just think it's important to remember this is really hard and we need to adapt our parenting, right? So we're caught in this sort of gap between the technologies are here, they've been around, the rate of change continues to accelerate, and we're behind from a parenting standpoint, right? We keep getting caught by surprise. So the reason that the kids aren't even really guinea pigs, right? Because we haven't really changed that much as adults, because there's this gap. So what are the best practices? I think it's not thinking so much about limiting, and I'm a big fan of structure and limiting the technologies, but I think to think a little bit broader can be a little bit more empowering. So there's 3 things that I think they're really struggling with, and then 3 solutions to that I think help parents. So they're really struggling, like I already mentioned, with exhaustion, and teenagers today and kids in general simply are not getting enough sleep, and they're not taking breaks during the day without their screens, right? Like they have no downtime. They take their phones to the bathroom, right? Like it's always with them. So rest really becomes a core skill.
I love that section, by the way. In your book, when I was a child, that was my biggest fight with my parents, is I was doing sports all the time. And so I won't go to bed at 8 o'clock, and they'd be like, how can you be going to bed so early? And you need to do your homework. And I love that you said health comes first, homework comes second.
Yeah.
It's like, finally, I'm vindicated. The scientist agrees with my teenage self.
We have tons of data.
Exactly.
You were right.
Completely. I want to forward that page, take a Xerox, send it off to them.
Yeah. Well, the difference now is that a lot of our high-achieving kids will not prioritize their own health because they believe that they're going to fall behind if they don't do 10 hours of homework at night or whatever. And in fact, kids today they don't have more homework, and they're not doing more homework. Even the super high achieving ones, they are just taking longer to do the homework because they're constantly interrupted by all the alerts and social media and all the things on their technology, and because they haven't learned to focus.
I loved that. That whole section was amazing. One of the things I think of though too is that when we did research and we'd have to go to the library, there's like a more like defined set of things that we have. But with the internet, it's kind of hard to know when to stop doing the research and to start doing the writing. So even that is kind of changing. It changes how you write sermons for sure, and I'm sure it's changed how you write books.
I know. Well, just think about when you first started writing sermons. It was like us in high school. We just read the book.
If you didn't have the book in in the office that you had, that would be it. You can't say anything about it other than what you can remember.
Right.
Whereas now I can be like, oh my gosh, I thought Arthur Schopenhauer said something about music, and so then you can kind of follow that in a way that you just couldn't
down a
before.
rabbit hole.
Yeah. So sleep is the first thing.
Sleep is the first thing.
And exhaustion.
The second thing
and downtime is part of that too.
Downtime,
Yeah.
teenagers need 9 hours and 20 minutes of sleep.
I love that.
And 85% of them don't even get 8 hours of sleep on a daily
Yeah.
basis. So it's really, and that's the interesting thing about trying to get kids to go to sleep, teenagers especially, to go to sleep now is, first of all, they're staying up later than their parents, right? Like we're all
Yeah.
middle-aged. We
Right,
don't want to stay
completely.
up so late. So they have more control and less structure
Yeah.
around that. And so we need to work with their existing motivations, right? If they're really motivated to do well in school, we need to help them see that they will do better in school when their brain is rested, that your brain doesn't learn well when it's exhausted, right? That they start to spin and they don't really realize how it's affecting them.
Yeah, definitely.
And then we have to provide the sort of support and structure around all of the things that I'm talking about, but especially around sleep, that we would we provide our kids with a lot of support and a lot of structure around their sports and their school and their
Right.
arts and things like that. But really, it does need to be their well-being.
An example
first.
used a lot is like driving. It's like you don't just hand
Yeah.
the keys and say go for it. We have practices to make sure that people are ready by the time they get there. And you're right. It's like helping them to put into practice kind of like a plan or habits or routines that help prepare them for sleep. Like not having their cell phone in the room with them during that last hour, reading a book for an hour before they go to sleep. Those things.
Most of these kids are so tired they couldn't read for an hour right before they would go to sleep, right? Which is sort of an interesting thing. But that's also a really simple structural solution, having a charging station outside of their bedroom and having that be a family norm, right? It sounds so, it is so simple. And it's also so much easier than trying to convince them to not be on their phones when their phone is right by their pillow.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I love that. Just like very simple things you could do. So sleep was the first thing.
The second thing is that they're incredibly overstimulated, and that's really having a very big biochemical kind of effect on their nervous system. All the stimulation of the reward system in their brain is making it really hard for them to focus. I mean, it has a lot of negative effects. One of them is that their attention is really impacted. And that's happening at a time in which, all these devices are designed to command their attention in a really compulsive, really addictive way. So the next skill that we have to practice with them is focus, right? The ability to sustain attention towards something, because that enables them to learn, it enables them to develop mastery, and that will lead to their success and also happiness. It's really hard to feel fulfilled, to do meaningful work if you haven't developed any sort of mastery, if you can't sort of drop in to a state of deep focus, and that's a very different type of accomplishment than getting to the next level in a video game.
Yeah, that was one of the most powerful sections of the book for me. And my wife is a law professor. They do a summer program to help prepare law students. And I was like, gosh, you get to design a presentation based on that section. Because you talked about when you were in high school and you had study hall in your high school. And so it was enforced that for 2 hours, you'd better bring all the materials you needed into that room because you're not going to get up and go and get things that you forgot. And just how helpful that was in terms of training your ability to pay attention to something and to really be focused on it.
And it's amazing to me because my kids can't, we do study hall at home.
Yeah, right.
But they can't go 2 hours sitting. But for us, it was like a few people would have to go to the restroom, right? There was a proctor. There was a whole process. We were all aware of who was getting up, or if somebody was like. It was a given that from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. every night, like we would just sit down and handwrite our papers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like it was a completely different thing. And what was really different about it emotionally was that it was a very relaxed focus, right? We were able to drop in and just get a truly enormous amount of homework done. I mean, some of us, were able to do that. The students among us were able and willing to do that. And today, it's not the kids don't focus at all. It's that they can't do it in a relaxed way. They can't work with the sort of neurochemistry of being in the zone.
Right.
They need to use stress.
Yeah.
They need to, so we all know that having a deadline is very motivating. It creates a psychological state. Psychologists call it tunneling, right? It's an over-anxious focus on the thing that you're afraid of. Right?
Completely.
It literally will obliterate your peripheral vision. It causes binocular vision, and that is a form of focus, of course.
Right.
It's just not a very healthy one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the reason why I start work on the sermon on Sunday night for the next Sunday, because I'm so much more productive writing on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday than I am at Saturday night at like 11:30, and I've only got a third of it done. Because that fear is just, it almost makes it harder. Like it takes longer to get the amount work that need to done.
Yeah, it's going to take longer. Your insights are not going to be, you're not going to have the same sort of creative insights that you would have if your focus was relaxed, because to rely on like the panic of a deadline, right? It can be very motivating and very focusing, but it's not your best thinking.
Yeah.
And for these kids, and for you as well, all of us, our overall well-being is really impacted. When you're relying on stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, it's no wonder these kids are anxious and depressed.
Yeah, definitely. And what was the third thing?
Connection. We already touched on it a little bit, that teenagers today are a really interesting study in loneliness. And so as families and communities, we need to really pay attention to the face-to-face connections that they have and help them understand that just because somebody has liked an Instagram post it's not the same thing as true connection. All of us need to feel like we're connected to something larger than ourselves. And so ironically, one of the best ways that we can help these kids feel more connected is to do the opposite of what is kind of instinctual, and that is to not focus on them so much, right? Like the anxious focus on the self, whether it's your own self or your child, the individual, it tends to make things worse, to get them out helping other people. So this is something psychologists call a move from self-survival to species survival. How can they stop worrying about how they're going to get through the next week of where they have 2 tests and a big game, and how they're going to help the people around them survive this difficult period? What can they do? And I think it's really important with this group of kids, with this generation, or maybe for all of us, to just begin where you are, right? So the first way to feel connected is to look up from your phone while you're checking out at the Trader Joe's, right? Acknowledge the person who is working with you.
Exactly.
Yeah, right?
Completely.
Like they're actually so surrounded by people. It's not like you have to say, you know what, you're going to be volunteering 3 times a week from here on out because you're too anxious and depressed. It's more like, okay, let's just put the phone down while you're with live people.
Right, completely. Yeah, it's so funny because, I mean, I loved how you say, I mean, maybe we need to encourage them to hang out more in a way that...
Totally. Totally. We were having one of our kids wasn't bringing any of... I have to just say her. I have 3 girls and a boy, and I have to be very careful not to reveal who is who. So even though I clearly...
We'll call her Sarah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's so hard for me in my head.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of them wasn't bringing their friends over, and she revealed that it was because we never had any good food. And so then my sister-in-law comes over, and I was like grappling with it because part of the overstimulation is all the highly processed foods, hyperpalatable stuff. Sugar isn't going to help anybody. I have all these high horses about all of this. And my sister-in-law was in the neighborhood, and she came over with 2 huge bags from Trader Joe's of just like full junk food, stuff I never buy. And you wouldn't believe the crowd of teenagers that was there for like, and so I thought, okay, So I have to prioritize, like hanging out in person
Right.
is a very high priority.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is buy those little frozen
Yeah.
bonbon-y things from
exactly.
Trader Joe's.
Right, completely. It's that simple. It's funny because I think a lot of what I do today is just like people get into conflicts and they try to resolve the conflicts by text or by email. And I always say, just talk to people face to face. But this is so much beyond that. It's just like you try to talk to people face to face, even if it isn't an issue where you're going to have conflict, because it's important to have that face to face. And we talk about this at church all the time. It's just like, is church like trying to accommodate this culture that's online, or is church like an antidote to that? And on the radio, I said it was an antidote to it. And there was a rabbi who's like 15 years younger than me. He was so offended by that because he felt like I was denigrating online things. But there is something about us that we.
Yes, I actually think that's so important. I am 100% in agreement with you that it's an antidote to it, and that all the online things, that's really about the head more than the heart,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not, you can learn a lot online and you can be engaged in whatever the sermon you might have missed was, and
Right,
I think that there is a place for online things, but if instead of going to church, you're just watching it on TV or online or just listening to it while you do your regular workout or whatever, you're missing the thing that is, I think, most helpful in this era, and that is to really feel connected to real live human beings, an actual church community.
And that's the interesting thing about church too. There's like a group of people that you'll see and you'll always know they're going to be there, and there can be your old friends. But it's like no one invited any of the people who are coming. They just like who comes. And so you're always also exposed to new people who you would never meet in your life, and it's a big part of it. I think a lot of times as I was reading your book, I just over and over kept thinking, how can we help young people as a church? And I was just wondering if you had like any suggestions for that, or just
I just think providing a relevant space for them that's like really open, that is really affirming. For me, I think the most positive part of my childhood was my youth group. And it's been really sad for me that my kids have never really engaged in anything like that because the church doesn't feel all that relevant to them. Although I tell them about the activities, the things that we used to do, and they want to recreate the like Polaroid parties that we had, and the like things that we used to do. So I think being a space that allows them to connect to one another. I think all of these kids need spaces that are actually technology free, where the social norm is that you're not taking tons of pictures and posting them online. You're just experiencing each other, and that's hard. It's hard. I think that the church has a real challenge ahead of us to be both relevant and this space where they can be less stimulated and more connected.
Yeah, last week we had roller skating in the cathedral.
Oh my God, that's so cool. I should send my kids here.
I know, really. But by the same token, I got, heard from an old seminary professor who's just very opposed to that. Just thought that was a very bad thing to do. But it was the one person, like 50 people loved it, one person, not so much. But you're right to just always be thinking. I think about that, especially with every legislation. Every time I vote, I think, what will this mean for kids? And one of the things you are so good about is the section on drugs, because anyone who's not paying attention to these things, it's hard to know the things that you know about. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about legalization of marijuana in particular. But what do we do about this when society's making these decisions on one hand, but they have these huge ramifications for children?
Yeah, so the ramifications that I think that most people don't understand related to marijuana and kids is that THC interacts in the adolescent brain really differently than it does in the adult brain, just like for starters. So we're only talking about teenagers here. I really get railed by the pro-marijuana lobby when I start going into this whole thing. You can imagine the email I get. Okay, so we're just talking about teenagers. It's never legal for teenagers, or for under 18.
Is that the age? I didn't even know that. I'm so ignorant.
Or 21.
Probably 21.
Probably 21. Okay, but here's the thing about that even.
Yeah, still.
That adolescence is the period of growth, brain growth, it's transformative to the human brain. A lot is happening. The entire brain gets remodeled during adolescence, and that happens from about 3 years before there are sort of physical signs of puberty, all the way through age 24 to 26. So girls' puberty ends about 24, boys about 26 on average, right? Wow. Very long decade here. Yeah. And while that brain is remodeling, it's growing tremendously, and the connections are wiring so that we gain fluency. All kinds of amazing and really important things happen during adolescence. It's why the things you learn as a teenager, you tend to remember for the rest of your life.
Like those music.
Yes, music lyrics from high school,
from 8th grade.
It's still like the only ones I know.
Yes, exactly. I wish I'd known that. I should have been learning Latin or something.
I know, totally. So part of the way that brain growth happens, it comes through certain receptors in the brain which are affected by THC. Yeah. So the active ingredient in marijuana, THC, the thing that makes you high, will bind with the brain's CB1 receptor. It stays in that receptor for quite a while. And while it's in that receptor, the brain
quite a while,
growth,
meaning like getting high on the weekend and until
5
Friday,
to 7 days later.
Yeah, so Friday
it's still like lingering in the receptor. So they're not still high.
Yeah.
But that brain growth is halted in those receptors. Yeah. It cannot continue the myelination. It just stops. And so it's really important for kids to understand that. The other thing that I think is there's two more things actually. One is that, well, first of all, kids don't know that, right? Yeah. I don't think parents know that either. And so this legalization has created an attitude where it's like, this isn't harmful, this is medicinal, you're super anxious. I have teenagers replaying to me all the time, this is the best way for me to deal with my anxiety. Mm. And what they're saying, what I hear is the best way for you to deal with your anxiety is to halt your brain growth. Yeah. That does not seem like a very healthy coping mechanism. But what we're seeing in the data is a massive growth of kids who believe that daily use of marijuana is not harmful, right? And so, of course, usage follows our beliefs about what it, even just 5 years ago, almost a large majority of high school students believed that daily use of marijuana would hurt you. Yeah. And now we're down under half. Of kids that believe that. So they just don't understand. Now, the other thing about marijuana use in adolescence is that for everybody, one of the effects is that it makes pleasurable experiences more pleasurable. But for teenagers, because it stays in the receptor longer, and also because their brain is much more primed towards the reward system, they get a much bigger hit of dopamine. And it's much more habit forming, it's much more pleasurable to them. Candy is much more everything pleasurable is more pleasurable to the teenage brain. Interesting. That's why they like junk food so much, right? But for marijuana usage, it means that their brain is developing around this higher level of pleasure, and they can't really experience that otherwise. So I was talking to one of my kids who's in college, and she has somebody living in her dorm who gets stoned before every meal because otherwise he can't eat because it's just not, the food is just not as pleasurable. It just feels dull, right? And it was amazing to me that they don't really understand. I mean, even with me, believe me, my kids have been getting this information quite a lot. It's like amazing how little they take in, you know? Because she was like, do you think that this is a problem? Do you think that everybody says that marijuana is not addictive, but he seems really addicted. Yeah. Like, actually, marijuana is very addictive in the very high levels of THC that we're seeing right now. I would say that that's very habit forming. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And like you say, it's just the intensity of feeling is, that's part of the problem too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that section of the book was upsetting for me to read, just because I do see society making these huge changes, and I just don't know how thoughtful we've been in going down this path.
And thinking about how it's affecting our young people,
Yeah.
like the messages and how, any teenager anywhere can have marijuana delivered to their home, right?
Yeah.
They can order it online. It's just totally accessible everywhere, and they don't know that it's simply not the same as it will be once they're an adult.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said about the bus ads and billboards,
You can't escape it.
You cannot escape it. Mm-mm. You cannot escape it. I want to change gears a little bit, and we were talking about just like connection and loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
Sex is one part of the book that you talk about too, so on the one hand, you say that young people today are having less sex because they're just having less face-to-face contact with anybody.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, their understanding of sex has been so changed by the internet and in particular pornography.
It's not even just their understanding of it. It's their sexuality is really altered. And some of it is, and by pornography, right? Pornography exposure, even among kids. I mean, in kids who are in families that do everything that they can to avoid it,
exactly.
right? Like, it's not that parents are like, oh, go ahead, watch porn in your bedroom, right? Like, that's not it. But I mean, 9, 10, 11 years old, we don't have really good data about this, but it's like younger and younger.
Yeah.
And once these kids see those things, they can never unsee them.
Yeah.
And so immediately they formulate certain thoughts about especially female sexuality, what it means, and then they are they're having sex online. Like, sexting is a real thing. So 20 almost a quarter of middle schoolers have received a sext, and that of somebody that they know.
Wow.
And about 12% of middle schoolers have sent a pornographic picture of themselves to somebody that they know.
Yeah.
So this tells us, like, their sexual development is really being impacted by this. And then, of course, you have other trends in the culture too that aren't negative, right? But they're confusing. Sexuality has become a much broader thing. It used to be thought of as something that was binary. Of course, it's not anymore. And gender, everything has changed.
Yes,
And so these kids need more guidance. They need more good information about what the truth is around these things, so that they're not, going into a huge number of teenagers are using Tinder, right? So that's like a whole other thing. So what this means for parents is that there's no just like one sex talk. It used to be one and done, and it was like tremendously ineffective, right?
Yeah.
Like, but we were okay. Somehow we were all right.
It's like what you're saying is, and this is part of the drug conversation and the sex. Like, my kids know more about some of these things. Well, they're always going to know more than we do, because they know what's happening in their school with their friends. And I'm not talking to like 15, like 18-year-olds, but they are. And so it is more of a conversation too, where there's some learning happening on this end for sure.
Yeah, definitely, and a lot of discomfort. Like, parents are always saying to me, I just can't have like the 100,000 conversations I need to have about porn and all these things, because it's just terrible. Like, I'm too uncomfortable. I'm like, well, so am I.
Yeah.
Just by the way, I've written this whole book about all the things you have to talk to your kids about. about. And so my best advice is do it in a place where you don't have to make eye contact with them, because it's easier, especially for teenage boys. It's very, very hard for them to make eye contact while having these things. Cars are great. You'll both want to feel like you want to hurl yourself out of the moving car, but I feel that way. They are like 100 times more
completely
uncomfortable about the whole thing. But what I've found, even though I have never one single time felt comfortable talking about all of this stuff with my kids, it's been enough to just have those short little conversations. Another good practice is to ask them questions about what they know, because then you can sort of figure out where you need to fill in. But also, it's just easier, right? What do you know about this? Are you concerned about so-and-so's behavior in this way, right? To get them talking about it, that has so far, knock wood, I don't want to jinx myself or my kids, but it's worked pretty well, right? I get plenty of phone calls from college telling me things that, my mother would have died if I had. But I'm so glad that they're talking through all of these issues with me. And by the way, I can't always take those phone calls. A lot of times I'm like, hey, honey, I'm really in the middle of something at work right now. Let me just call you right back. Like, hang up, breathe, make some notes, like talking points. Okay, so what were you saying? That was real interesting.
I think one of my favorite things that you said in the book is about talking about sex with your partner. And you said, if you can't talk about the sexual act that you're thinking about, then you probably shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, right.
I thought that was, that was really helpful to just, and I think that's what kids need, is they need some kind of tool. Like, how do I decide about what I'm going to do, with my girlfriend or what have you. Right. Yeah, it's a very different world for sure.
And, it's an interesting thing. So the conversations with my kids around that is like, they're like, the boys in particular, they can't talk about anything, right? So completely. Much less sober, right? And so, these are interesting conversations where the kids themselves can really see the sort of shortcomings in their own social skills. And at least then they have a vision for where they're headed, or where the ideal place is.
Yeah, and having a relationship with people who care about you, that's like baseline. That's just
totally,
and yet that's not something we can take for granted at all.
No.
Yeah.
I did not think we were going to be having this conversation.
I know. Saying. I just no one thinks they're going to come to Grace Cathedral and talk about sex, but it's unavoidable,
It is. And I think it actually reflects an adaptation we really need to make as a society. And that is that, when I was my youth group, sex ed was don't do it.
Right.
There was like rules around touching and all kinds of like very specific guidelines that were sort of, it's all off limits. And these kids, their sexuality is developing, like it or not, and they are getting loads of information that is not helpful. So to acknowledge like sexuality is a positive thing. It's developing.
Exactly.
You're going to have sexual feelings. I don't really want to hear about them as your parent, but you know what I mean? Like I don't want to be involved in that.
One of the things you have, and it's not even very highlighted, it's almost in I think it's in one of your appendices. And what it says is when you talk to your children, you explain to them, you don't want somebody who's a pornographer who's getting paid to like exploit people, being the one who's educating you about what, it was like a little tiny little thing, but I thought was important.
Yeah. And once you say that to a teenager, they don't want to be exploited either.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So they sort of start to understand, okay, there are good sources of information and there are bad sources of information, and I'm like willing to talk to you about all of it, and there's going to be no punishment. There's going to be no, we're just going to have an open conversation.
Yeah. Another part of it's funny because I didn't realize how much I loved about the book, and maybe I am going to be preaching about it because it's inside me, But
Sorry.
one of the things you say is like, regardless of just what your philosophy is about accepting LGBTQ plus people, that everything you say in your household, you may be saying to somebody who's an LGBTQ person, who's your child, who needs to hear acceptance and love from you. So regardless of how you feel about these political issues, you need to change your attitude when it comes to how you deal with your children.
Yeah, you need to understand that you're either forming a connection with them
Right.
or you're cutting that connection off, and they need that connection.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. That is one of the biggest changes, I think. Because our kids, when I was in high school, another boy asked me out on a date, and it was a lovely thing. He was a sweet, sweet person, and it wasn't something that we ended up going and go on a date with. But it took incredible courage for him to do that, and I recognize that. But it's a different world now, where I don't think I knew transgendered people when I was in high school who were not adults. But now it's just a very different world that our children are living in.
Yeah, they have a completely different framework for thinking about it all, and it's more complex. I think it's also more true to real. It's
life,
really
exactly.
positive in a lot of
Right.
ways, but they need to not be out on their own.
Right.
And they need to not feel like they're educating us.
Yeah, exactly. Which they almost can't help, but in some respects.
Oh yeah, we've had some conversations where I was like, wow, I'm getting it all wrong.
Okay. Completely. Yeah. But one of our traditions is we ask people to write questions on note cards. And so Rebecca Nessel connects the cards and people have questions. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like your own teenage life. Like, what are some of your vivid memories of growing up? And just like, how did you kind of get into this place where you became someone who helps parents to be able to connect with teenagers and understand them?
Well, I actually had a really positive adolescence. I have a lot of really positive memories. I think part of the reason is that I had really strong sense of community, both at my church and also my school community.
Yeah.
I have these hilarious memories, which, I think a lot of my own adolescence applies not at all to parenting, right?
Yeah.
So my big sex talk, my mom told my dad, I did not know this, my mom told my dad that he was driving me down to boarding school, and she said, you have to talk to her about sex in high school and like what might be happening and on the way. And so we had been in the car for 6 hours. We had about a half an hour left to go. And he
6
says
hours
to me,
and a half hour.
yeah, I can remember like the landscape. I knew it was a significant, I knew what he was trying to say was significant. What he said was, boys are going to try and get you on the rack.
And I still don't know what that means.
No. So I had no idea, right? I had no idea. And I was like, okay. And he said, just say no. Especially the older boys, watch out for the older boys. I was like, all right. I was looking out the window away from him. I got 0 from that. I was 35 years old. And it was Thanksgiving, and he and my uncle were joking around, and he said something about, oh, he's just trying to get her on the rack. And I was like, oh my God, that was my sex talk? I did not know what you meant. My mom was so mad. I was 35 years old, and my mom left the table. She was so mad, right? So this is, can you imagine today if that were the only, I didn't get it at all. I thought he was talking about drugs or something.
Yeah.
I was so naive that I didn't have any reference I couldn't have even guessed that that's what it was about.
Yeah, I felt very much just in the same way you felt kind of like your youth group's telling you not to touch boys. Yeah. I felt very cut adrift, like no one was really giving me any guidance about anything, and I didn't know what was. It would have been helpful to have more people to talk to about just, what are your guidelines? What's your philosophy of having relationships and sexual relationships? It would have been good for me to have more than the just don't get them on the rack. Okay. When parents look back on their parenting, I was just going to ask something like this myself. When parents look back on their parenting mistakes, is it advisable for them to apologize to their children?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the thing is, we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're like me, you make them repeatedly. One of the most important things that kids can learn is how to repair a mistake.
Yeah.
This is an incredibly important life skill. And so being really deliberate about like what went wrong, acknowledging how it made them feel. Like if you yell in a situation in which it's like not called for or whatever it might be, to say like, I could tell that you just felt really distant from me when I was doing that. Like acknowledging their feelings from your mistake is a very important repair, because it gives you more freedom to take more risks, because you know that you can stay in connection and in relationship with them even when you're not perfect. This stuff is super hard. And you know what? It's hard for them too. Their social skills aren't that great relative to previous generations. And so one of the most important social skill we can give them is the ability to make repairs and to practice forgiveness, because their peers are making mistakes too, right? So that this is... So it's actually good if you're bad at if you make a lot of mistakes. If you can repair it.
Right. It may be more important for the person to learn how to repair things than it is whatever the presenting issue is.
You just can't do things perfectly.
Honestly, the whole time we've been talking, I've had this mental image in my head of these like bar charts, like sex, the drug conversations, the study hall of focus. It's like, and man, I'm pretty low on some of these,
Yeah, it's not too late.
It's
College
not too late,
students,
though.
they have a lot of
Exactly
questions.
Right. They definitely do. They definitely do. But yeah, I have definitely thought about just the mistakes. And in the book you talk about, there's authoritative parenting, which is between it's between permissive parenting and authoritarian.
Yeah.
So authoritarian, and it's hard. The authoritarian is like, you do this or else.
Just being controlling, dictatorial.
And the permissive is just like, I don't know, honey, whatever you do, we'll support you.
And
the authoritative is just like, let's set up some rules and guidelines for how we work with together. One of my favorite things you say too is that you talk about that we can't be managers of our teenagers, that we're more like coaches. And sometimes our kids will fire us as managers.
We can't be their chief of staff anymore. Even though it's so much easier to just do certain things for them, it's really important for them to learn to do them for themselves so that they have the sense that they can control their own lives.
But it is so easy to slip into the authoritarian or the permissive when you don't know what to do. Would kids be better off if they were kept away from all computer technology until they were teenagers? And does technology kill the imagination?
Nope. I think actually, it's really tempting to just go back to become very retro. And that's just not where we are. It's not going to happen. It's not even, I think it can be sort of a helpful thought experiment to figure out like where a balance is, but to just say no on all across the board it's just not going to work. Right.
And one of the things you do is, and this was the basis of our parenting philosophy, was you start out really like rigid and controlling, and then as children get older, they learn how to kind of self-manage. And
so there's like more scaffolding the younger they are.
That's a good way of putting it. That's a better image.
And then as they prove that they can operate, that they are always remembering to charge their phone outside their room, as they show that they're using their technology in healthy ways to fuel their imagination, because it certainly doesn't kill all creativity. What kills all creativity is having no downtime, right? So when they show that they're getting enough rest and that they're managing their lives well, then you start to pull away the scaffolding and let them do it all themselves. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. If toddlers are put on Ritalin, and are they just a dangerous drug, as many as you're considering the deadly side effects? Do you have good eyesight?
Yeah, well, I am not a psychiatrist.
Okay,
but I will say, I think that there are a lot of things that we know are affecting our kids' attention of kids at all ages and adults as
Yeah.
well. And drugs are not necessarily the best way to deal with their inhibited dopamine function,
Yeah.
right? So the things that are affecting their dopamine function, which then affects their attention, there's a lot of things that are within our control. Sleep and food is two of the biggest ones. Sleep, food, exercise.
Well, even the focus, like having more of a study hall approach to
Yeah,
things.
being able to practice, focus is a skill,
Yeah.
not a skill that any 2-year-old has, just by the way. But by the time, but they build it, they learn to delay gratification through practice. So you don't need to have a super focused 2-year-olds. That's not a normal developmental thing.
But it was the sections on all the different ways that we're distracted, or it is eye-opening to think, like you said, it's just like not having any downtime. Where if you have 10 seconds while you're waiting for the elevator, you pull out your cell phone and you like look at something.
And that's about needing constant stimulation, right? That's not because like you're so busy and important that like the 10 seconds it's necessary for you to check something off your list. That's because our brain is looking for the next hit of dopamine, and it knows that it can't get it by just looking at your phone.
How has mindfulness training assisted teenagers in focusing on their life and goals? That was another question I had. Good one.
We have good research on mindfulness, and particularly mindfulness meditation and other forms of meditation, which I'm lumping those all together, even though they're a little bit distinct. And what we know is that it really helps kids learn to tolerate not being stimulated all the time. And in schools, it has really dramatic effects, measurable effects on their ability to learn, a reduction in violence in schools, reduction in bullying. It's just, to me, it points to the fact, like, we know these kids need more rest, that their brains need more rest. And mindfulness meditation is an interesting one because there is a little bit of stillness. There's a lot of stillness, lack of stimulation, and it's also a focusing practice.
Yeah.
So you get a little bit of a twofer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. At our kids' high school, they had a mindfulness practice every day as part of morning meeting. And you might think, oh, kids can't do that, but they can do that. They can learn that.
Oh, and they learn to love it. They go through withdrawal at first, and it's terrible, but then, but they really do. And I think that this is something that every wisdom tradition ever has had: a form of prayer, a form of meditation. Yeah. Stillness is a huge part of well-being. Yeah. And it's amazing to me, the research on just 10 minutes a day.
Yeah. Yeah, and the stillness is one thing, and you talked about gratitude practices too, just how important gratitude is. You're so right when you talk about these ancient wisdom traditions. They have so much to offer in the modern world. It's just hard to figure out how to connect people with those, because it is about gratitude and stillness, focus, meditation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this part of the new adolescence in youth of color? Public school teachers describe students from low-income, diverse, non-white communities who don't care about learning or speak disrespectful or use vulgar words to teachers. So what's happening for adolescents of color, and what's happening in terms of just like differences in class as we're making these big changes?
Yeah, so when we look at the sort of trends in mental illness, they're not equal across the board. The low income and at-risk kids, that we're seeing much steeper increases in anxiety and depression. They're dealing with lots and lots of trauma on top of everything else. So, and it's happening to girls much faster than.
Yeah,
the suicide rate is still higher for boys. I don't want us to lose sight of that.
Right.
But the rates of suicidality are increasing much faster for girls, the rates of depression and anxiety. Social media overuse seems to affect girls much more than video game overuse seems to affect boys in high school. Once they're out of college or young adults, the video game use seems to be... it goes back and forth. I think it's a really important thing to remember that it's not affecting everybody equally. And these kids are really legitimately stressed. It's not just the things that we've been talking about in terms of not getting enough sleep. I mean, across the board that's happening,
Yeah.
but like they're really, really stressed about shootings in schools, for example.
Right,
68% of teenagers today are worried about there being a shooting in their school. Like, this is something that they carry with them. Climate crisis is hitting them much harder, right? In terms of like their daily worry about it. And so the low income kids are taking the brunt of the fear around deportation and a lot of the things, hate crimes, and a lot of the things that are happening are hitting lower income communities much harder.
Yeah. And I can imagine just like for young people who have no place to live, and homelessness among young people
Yes,
too.
it's unbelievable.
It is
Yeah.
unbelievable. It says 1 in 4 adolescents. Oh, this is too. It's too. I can't read it. Okay. Location apps. Good, bad.
I love
Taking the phone away as a consequence. Is that good or bad? And consequences in general. What works?
Consequences, for those of you who aren't parenting right now, is a euphemism for punishment.
That's
Right?
great.
As
I'm so glad
parents,
you told me
we
that.
were trained to like think about natural consequences instead of punishment, but then it just get translated to like all those things are use of force, right, in one way or another. Okay, so location apps, this is a really interesting one. Tracking your kids on their phone. These kids have so much less freedom than we had. And it's an interesting conundrum, right? Like, so whether or not to track them all the time.
Right.
And what I would say is it's a really important conversation to have with your kids, right? It can be sort of a safety mechanism. When our kids started driving, a couple of them we had on Life 360 because to just like watch their driving, and especially if they were driving somewhere at night that they'd never been before, and that proved to be an excellent thing to do. When one of them was in an accident, we knew right away. Right? So it can be really positive. It can also really kill their sense that they are responsible for themselves. And if they think that you're tracking them all the time, then a part of their brain is like, she's still responsible for me, right? What we know about teenagers is that the more autonomous they feel, the more responsible for their own behavior that they feel, the better they are at making decisions.
Yeah, because when I read the question, I guessed that you would say no location apps, but it's interesting about the driving as being an exception.
Yeah, and we turn them on, we turn them off, they turn them off, then we have a whole conversation about why they turned it off,
Right.
and the whole, you know what I mean? And that's what I would say about the consequences and taking the phones away and everything.
Yeah.
If they aren't using their phones responsibly, then absolutely the unnatural consequence is to become more involved in their phone usage. And so taking it away at night or having them remove social media apps or whatever, I think structure and engagement and involvement really, really important, even with older teenagers. If you're paying for their data plan or their phone or any part of it, it's your phone.
Yeah.
You're responsible for what they're doing with it,
Right.
right? So being involved in that way. My kids own their own phones and pay for their cell phone plans.
Yeah.
They pay me because they're on my thing.
Right.
But I'm still very, very involved, or as involved, they're older teenagers now, as I can be, and in conversation. The thing is, if you just take it away, if you just punish them, if you're using sort of force around it all, then you you lose the opportunity to be in conversation
Well,
with
that's what
them.
was interesting to me too. Is like you took a kind of a black and white situation. Either you take away the phone or you don't. And you talked about other kind of gray areas. Like I never thought of like you can't use the phone after 7:00 or deleting apps that or you've been misusing. Or I mean, so there are other things, but that makes it more of a conversation and less
Yeah.
of a like
And-
authoritarian. I'm taking the phone away.
And more of a skill building opportunity. So when one of my kids, for example, was like becoming very compulsive, we noticed she was just constantly checking her phone.
Yeah.
Then what we did was set it up so that she would have to like scroll to a back page. We looked at what she was compulsively checking, social media, and like even then once we moved all the social media to a back page, she was checking email, which like no teenagers today check their email. So it was like her brain was just looking for
Wanted to do
something,
that,
right?
yeah.
So then we put that in on a back page, and then she created a shortcut. She actually showed me how to do this, but she created a shortcut where she just pushes the home button 3 times fast, and if the whole thing goes black and white, it makes the whole phone super uncompelling.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's
So another
like,
thing is making your phone black and white.
yeah.
Yeah. And then other consequences. Is there anything more you have to say about consequences? I didn't realize it was punishments, but you're right. It is.
Totally. No, I just think that, like, especially with teenagers, the more we can engage them in learning, right, and repairing
Yeah.
mistakes and moving forward from in a place of connection with you, because then you still maintain some influence.
Yeah. How much is too much when it comes to phones, video games, tweens, and teens, like from the ages of 11 to 14? I.e., what's a good daily limit? Also, any guidance about Snapchat?
Oh, Snapchat. Yeah. So yes, the guidance around like time limits is just to realize that there is a real dosage effect. I think it's like it varies by age, but once you get over the 2-hour mark and it's like linear. Social media and device use is positive for I think the first hour, maybe hour and 20 minutes. And this was like a 2015 study, so it's already like who knows,
Yeah.
right? But just to like the general guideline is device use is actually positive for kids for some short amount of time, or
Yeah.
not like an hour and 20 minutes is a short amount of time, but in the same way that I was only allowed to watch the Brady Bunch, right? Or like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like I had a half an hour
Yeah.
of television, like having some sort of like, it is healthy for them to be able to connect and participate in what's happening. And then once they get to 5 hours, I think their suicidality goes up by 30 or 40%. I don't actually know that, but it's like, it's massive.
So it's
Yeah.
basically like 1 or 2 hours for younger 11 to 14.
Yeah, and that it's like, it's not all bad, but overuse tends to be,
This is a great question. Do you have any helpful hints for young adults who are struggling with becoming independent adults?
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of this, and so as parents, are a lot of time our knee-jerk reaction to sort of failure to launch is to become more involved, right? To become more helpful, and what they really need is to struggle. There is value in struggle, and that they're learning to develop these skills on their own. In order to become more independent, they need to practice independence.
Yeah.
And so we need to not do so much for them, right? It's worrying to us, and we don't want to see them struggle, but it's their journey, and struggle is always a part of the journey.
Yeah. We don't have very many more questions, but we did run out of time. But I wonder if you can answer one last question, which is, what signs of hope do you see? I mean, there's been such huge change,
Yeah.
and it's had these negative effects in terms of mental health and stuff. But what are some of the bright kind of silver linings?
I
you're
think
seeing?
the biggest thing that I hope that everybody takes away from this is, even though the trends are discouraging, we understand what's happening. We know what's happening.
Yeah.
And because we understand what's happening, we understand the corrections. And so none of this is actually that complex, right? It's not that it's all easy, but getting more sleep. This is free. Teenagers love to sleep, right? I mean, the solutions are right before us. So it's not we do need to adapt our society to the ways that it has changed, and we certainly need to adapt our parenting, but it's not like we don't know how or what the next step is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And even just like when you talk about brain chemistry kinds of things, I mean, we know these things too. And we've always known about, addiction and compulsions, and there's just more to be compulsive about, in our rich time.
It is.
In a way, it's what happens when you have a very kind of rich life and rich society.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to give my final announcements. Next week, we're going to be having Matthew Fox, the Episcopal priest and the activist theologian. He'll be talking about his book, The Tao of Thomas Aquinas, Fierce Wisdom for Hard Times. We have the 11 o'clock choral Eucharist upstairs today. And we're having a special choir from Peterborough Cathedral. So I can't wait to hear them. They've been practicing and preparing for this. We depend on you for gifts. If you can support us on your way out, that would be great. And I can't tell you how great it is to see you again, Christine. I enjoyed our last time together so much, and this was just perfect. Thanks so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you for having me. It's so fun.